Thank you, Malka, for the introduction, and thank you, So, for your kind words as well by way of introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've never actually been to Leicester, so this is my first time in the city, and Malka has kindly shown me around some of the sites, and we went to see the tomb of Richard III, which I'd heard a lot about. So thank you, and thank you to Iris also for arranging this event at very short notice. It's much appreciated. You've already heard way too much of my history, but I met Malka at Swansea University, where I was based until the end of 2014. I ran the Centre for Migration Policy Research there, really trying to generate evidence to inform the debate, in inverted commas, on migration and to inform the policy-making process. And really that's been my area of research and work for the last 20 years. It's really been about trying to better understand from the perspectives, in particular of migrants themselves, what's going on in terms of people's movements across, within countries, across boundaries, and then what happens to them in terms of policies and procedures that in some way make a whole range of assumptions about what those experiences are, and then misinterpret them in certain ways and try and push people into certain categories, and all the consequences of that you're, I'm sure, more than familiar with. So I moved to Coventry University in January of this year, full-time. I'm part of the, as was said, the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations, and I run there a team of researchers working around the theme of migration, displacement and belonging. So we cover lots of issues in relation to forced migration and refugee issues, but also European migration, issues around belonging and citizenship and relationships between communities, not just in the UK and Europe, but internationally. I've got researchers at the moment out in Indonesia doing work on recruitment agencies, and people in southeast Turkey looking at Syrian refugees in camp settlements. So there's a whole range of different things that we do, and I suppose one of the purposes of the visit today, apart from to see Malka in the city and to meet all of you, is to try and build some relationships between Coventry and Leicester in terms of potential areas of research and collaboration. And whilst I won't be talking about that directly in my talk today, I'm more than happy at the end to talk about things that we might do together. So researchers are increasingly, I mean, I've always been interested in what we can do with research in terms of making things better and for the better, but increasingly academics and academic funding is being driven by that objective. And of course people in communities are having budgets slashed and need to be able to gather information to support their particular agendas too. So I think the more that we can collaborate in that context, the better, and I hope that we can find ways of doing that. One of the things, when I was thinking about what we might talk about today, was really around what's going on now, I guess, in terms of the kind of run-up to the election and the kind of ways in which issues of asylum and migration have been represented or portrayed in some of those debates. In fact, I'm actually going to talk much more about what all this is about, rather than about the political debate. You hear the political debate every single day when you put on your radio or TV or see the papers. So I don't think you need me to tell you what's going on in terms of immigration in that context. It hasn't yet, I have to say, I'm touching wood frantically, it's not yet as bad as I thought it would be or could yet be. I think so far it hasn't dominated the discussion, with the exception of some of the earlier debates around UKIP, as much as I thought it might. But anything can change, and it probably will, as people run out of sort of serious topics to try and grab people's attention with and try to find other things. So I am going to talk a little bit about the political debate, but I'm really going to talk about what I think are the factors that underpin that debate, and drawing on really 20-25 years worth of research looking at attitude formation, the development of those sorts of narratives. So I'll say a little bit about the politics of migration. I'm also going to give you a little bit of a quiz to see, you know, what you think the dominant policy measures might be of the different political parties, and I'm almost certain you won't get them right, but I might be wrong. Then I'm really going to talk mostly in my talk about attitudes towards migration and asylum. Asylum because that's really where a lot of the debate started in the late 1990s, 2000s, but actually of course more recently, and particularly since 2004, we've seen a lot of the debate dominated by Eastern European migration trends. So it's shifted, but for me some of the factors that underlie those attitudes kind of cut across the different migrant groups. It's kind of irrelevant to the general public what the migrant background is, and much more important what it signifies or represents. I'll say a little bit about regional variations in attitudes because they're quite important. A lot of my work has been done around attitudes in the Welsh context where I was based previously, including the relationship between attitudes towards migration and race equality, and more importantly racism, in terms of how that is translating across into different groups in society. And really what those attitudes to asylum and migration mean. What are they about? Why do people think the things that they do? And what are they based upon? And I'll just conclude with some personal reflections on where I think the debate is and where I think it potentially could or should go once this May thing is over and we can all start, you know, trying to reconsolidate. My work is based on all sorts of often evidence-based attempts to try and inform the policy debate, so stuff around fact files, around asylum, papers that I've done around sort of changing and understanding public attitudes. That was a paper that I did for the Royal Geographical Society, launched at the Houses of Parliament, about 10 migration myths. All of these things are available online. So I've done various reports that I'm going to try and draw upon in reflecting back to you what I think is going on in terms of what the debate, in inverted commas, represents. But let's begin with a bit of a sort of a where are we at. Essentially, no pun intended, it's a mug's game, because this is kind of the level of the debate on migration at the moment. I don't know if you've seen this sort of mugs, this series of mugs that have been produced, that we're all supposed to sort of sit on our coffee table. It's supposed to be somehow, I don't know what anyone was thinking, quite frankly. It's been very highly criticised, particularly seeing as this is Labour's mug, controls on immigration. So that tells you something of how far to the right that debate has moved. And here we have the Greens standing up for migrants. This mug sold out within 20 minutes, apparently. So there's a kind of, you know, there's a kind of almost a trivialisation, actually, in some ways, of what is a really significant issue in terms of the lives of the people we're talking about. But I'm kind of putting them up there to tell you something about how this public debate has developed in the context of the pre-election campaign. They're all at it. I mean, you know, keep calm, UKIP are coming. So, you know, there's a mug for every occasion, essentially. And I don't know if you saw the debate, the leaders' debate, but Leanne Wood from Plaid Cymru was one of the few with SNP who stood up to some of the things that Nigel Farage was saying. So the Plaid Cymru Cup, Plaid Cymru is not prepared to go along with the scaremongering on immigration, which is great, but it's not quite as catchy. So, you know, you can see there's some sort of positioning that's going on, but it's going on in a very unnuanced, unsophisticated, headline sort of way, making statements about where the political parties stand on immigration. And I think in some way that tells us quite a lot about where this debate on migration is kind of at in the pre-election context. And then of course you get, this is UKIP of course, taking that very mug and then basically saying, well, it's one thing talking about controlling migration, but actually this is about European membership. So straight away you see that actually the debate on migration isn't just about migration, it's about other kinds of issues. You can't control immigration whilst being a member of the EU. So, you know, there's all sorts of ways in which the immigration debate is playing out. And the argument I'm going to make in this paper, this talk, is that actually it hasn't got a lot to do with immigration, one way or the other. It's actually got a lot more to do with other kinds of issues that political parties are trying to make a particular stand on. Anyway, whilst we're on that theme, we're going to have a little quiz. So, what I need you to tell me is which political party this policy belongs to. So, stronger border controls to tackle illegal immigration with proper entry and exit checks. Tories?
Labour.
Labour.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's Labour. Bear in mind that Labour were in power not so long ago, in theory trying to do exactly that. It's a bit easier to say than sometimes do for all sorts of complex reasons to do with international obligations, etc. Stop migrants from claiming child benefit dependents living outside the UK and remove those that fail to find work after 6 months.
Tory.
Tories? You're good at this, aren't you? Wait. better than me. I was quite shocked.
UKIP, but it just hints that they're doing something.
Yes, it's trying to sort of it's trying to position themselves as being...
on the bandwagon.
Yeah. Tougher English language tests for migrants seeking permanent residence.
UKIP.
Conservatives.
So we've got a little bit of everything going on here, haven't we? No one's quite sure. Actually, the UKIP man was right again. But the fact that you would even think that it could be any one of the political parties tells you something. Ensure that EU migrants have to earn their entitlements to benefits. That party we've all forgotten about. The Lib Dems.
That won't come through.
Okay, here's one just to sort of throw the cat among the pigeons. Migrants, actually it's not. Migrants illegally in the UK for over 5 years be allowed to remain unless they pose a serious danger to public safety. Agree? Absolutely. Bring net migration down to 50,000 a year.
Tory.
Labour.
All of them.
UKIP. So that's how mainstream the UKIP position has become. Bearing in mind that the current figures are about 285,000 people on net migration. We have around 80 to 90,000 students per year. I mean, you know, what is 50,000 going to be? That'll be half of our universities done for. And fines for employing illegal immigrants will be increased. Tories?
Labour.
Okay, so it was just a sort of to demonstrate in a way that whereas once upon a time you might have thought there was a clear distinction in terms of policies in relation to migration across the different parties, in fact there's almost, with the exception of the Greens, a fairly solid coalescence around certain kinds of themes, around entry control, about restricting welfare measures, about issues around entitlement and fines for illegal employment, etc. So there's really, I mean, there's not an awful lot to choose between many of the different political parties on this issue. And I suppose, you know, without, let's say, dwelling too long on that fact, what I want to really talk about is what is this about? Why has it come to be that migration has become such a significant issue in the debate in general, the political debate in general, and more especially that the parties have started to sort of coalesce around these kind of anti-immigration themes in a context where, quite frankly, as someone who's researched migration for 20 plus years, there is an absolute momentum to migration at a global level that is not for turning back. So it's a very, you know, it's out of sync with what we know to be happening globally. So the first thing to say, and it's nothing new to any of you, is that this kind of hostility is nothing new. And neither is the very negative media reporting on migration issues. I mean, we've done research, people have done research looking back at, you know, media reporting after the 1905 Aliens Act, for example, and you could see very clear parallels in some of the ways in which those issues of Jews coming into the East End of London were reported on in those times, not dissimilar to some of the things you see now. But I think it's also clear to me in my my research and my analysis that actually things have got significantly worse since 1997. Now, of course, there's all sorts of reasons why things might have got significantly worse, and I'll come on to those in a minute, but I just want to give you some evidence of that. I mean, you'll be familiar with it, but I just want to say that actually, if you look at the research evidence on that, it's very clear. So we have various ways of measuring attitudes. The most common one that you'll hear about is what's called the British Social Attitudes Surveys, but we also have European surveys that do a similar kind of thing, and international surveys such as the International Social Survey Programme. And they're relatively large, although not huge, cohorts of data that are gathered from people over a yearly or biannual basis in order to track changes over time in relation not just to migration but a whole series of social issues. You know, gay rights, civil marriages, racism, attitudes to religion, etc., etc. In addition to these kind of more kind of substantial surveys, there's been a plethora, and I mean a plethora, of ad hoc opinion polls on attitudes and to asylum and immigration. Now, some of those are of the kind of Ipsos Mori polls that I'm about to talk about, but others are of the variety of a sort of box on the front of the Sun newspaper or online that says, do you agree with yes, no, should we deport yes, no. So it's that kind of ad hoc opinion poll or survey. But it's the Ipsos Mori ones that we tend to refer to more because they, although they're only 1,000 people, which is actually nothing, they really kind of track these changes over time. And one of the things they track that's very interesting is the way in which the issue of migration has gone up the public agenda in terms of how important it's perceived to be as an issue relative to other issues. So the line that you're looking at is the green line. This is the race and immigration line. Now that's an important line because of course it says race/immigration, and thinking that those things are important doesn't necessarily mean that you think they're a problem, but that's the way the question has been interpreted. So you can see this line back in 1993 was by far the least important issue in the UK. And look where it is now. I mean, it's pretty much up there. At the moment it's up there with the economy. The economy has obviously gone up very substantially, but there have been times when it has been the #1 issue of importance for the British public. So in the mid-1990s, so we're looking at post-accession migration, race immigration, #1 important issue in the UK over economy, NHS, education, health, all those things that you would imagine to be much more important. So that gives you some sense of what's going on. And again, if you look at it in these terms, this is June last year, so it's not the most recent one. But again, at that point, 39% mentioned race immigration as being the most important issue, relative to, pensions are down here at 11%, and the euro and Europe down at 12%, and housing. So, you know, for me, this is quite shocking that it's such a disproportionately, in my view, important issue in terms of the British public. I do think it's important to put some caveats around that data. First of all, there's a real sloppiness around that question of immigration race, because of course immigration and race are not necessarily the same thing, albeit that they can be depending on your country of origin, etc. But also things like asylum seekers and refugees are not in there specifically at all. So the things that particularly in the early 2000s, when asylum numbers were the highest that they've ever been, really that was a very big concern amongst members of the public, but it was captured in this immigration race question, which is a quite particular one. So there are some kind of problems with the data. But I do think that this issue of asylum and refugees is very important, because although the number of asylum seekers has gone down very dramatically over the last 15 years, because the entry controls essentially have made things pretty much impossible for people to get in, the reality is that when you ask people about their attitudes to migration, they still think that we're predominantly talking about refugees and asylum seekers. So the Migration Observatory found that when thinking about immigrants, so asking people, who are you thinking of when I ask you about your attitude to immigration, respondents were most likely to think of asylum seekers, 62%, when in fact asylum seekers were the smallest group at 4%. And they were least likely to think about students, even though students are the largest group. So when you're asking people about their attitudes, they're actually thinking about asylum seekers and refugees. And the fact that their attitudes are so negative when they're thinking about that group tells you something about what's going on. Not necessarily in a good way, but it tells you something about what people's assumptions are about asylum seekers and refugees. And I think that this is important, and it's important for two reasons. One is that attitudes matter because they can translate into negative and racist behaviours, not just towards those particular groups, because we see that in terms of the narrative and in terms of behaviours, but also because in fact, in reality, what we see is that kind of attitude that's become legitimated towards asylum seekers and refugees spilling out, for want of a better word, into other groups, because of course there's nothing physiologically necessary to distinguish one group from another. And in fact, many people I work with, and probably some of you in this room, will talk about being told to go home, back where you came from, even if you're a third-generation British national, because this asylum debate has kind of pulled out the worst of people's assumptions about the groups that are coming. And I think because it's become so negative in relation to asylum specifically, it's become a very legitimated form of racism that nobody particularly challenges. They also matter, of course. I mean, I think this is the number one reason why they matter, because they affect people's lives. But they affect people's lives in another way, and that is that they influence the direction and content of asylum and immigration policy. So I used to work at the Home Office. I worked at the Home Office when David Blunkett was Home Secretary. I'm probably about to break the Official Secrets Act. But it was more than 10 years ago, so it's fine. And, you know, every day I'd sit in my office and I'd get that put in front of me, and that was a series of headlines from the media about what the Sun, the Express, the Daily Mail was saying about migration. And then I'd have Mr. Blunkett or his friends on the phone saying, this is really bad. What can we do about? Go do some research on X. Try and find out about Y. So it actually, that kind of media debate, that kind of attitudinal debate, it sort of creates this circular process of policy making, whereby, you know, at that time the Labour government was conducting focus groups to find out what people are anxious about. And the focus groups will say, we're really anxious about migration. So they create another bill which would confirm to people that they would be anxious about migration. Then there'd be lots of media coverage of the bill. Then people will go, oh, I'm really anxious about migration, there's another bill. Let's have a focus group and ask people what they're anxious about. And you've got this kind of literally every 2 years, this bill being produced to sort of reflect these anxieties. Now, I'm not exclusively blaming the media. I think it's a kind of round-tripping process. But I do think it's a problem because they do kind of mutually inform each other in very problematic ways. So you get what you call a kind of information round-tripping. You also get very problematic questions. So if I ask, I wouldn't ask one of you in this room because you're more knowledgeable than this, but say I were to ask somebody who thinks that migration is currently running at, you know, 45% of the UK population, which isn't an uncommon assumption, and I were to ask them, do you think there's too much migration? Chances are they'd say yes, because they don't actually know what the migration figures are. They don't actually know what the trends are, they don't know what the context is. So the way in which you ask the question and the knowledge that people have very much informs the kind of evidence that you'll then collect as a consequence. So there's all sorts of problems with the data we have on attitudes to migration. I also want to say a little bit about regional differences in attitudes, and I'm going to again come back specifically to asylum, but partly because that's my own particular interest. But this first point really applies to both asylum and migration. I don't think the categories matter in that sense. And what we know from all of the research that we've done and all the collation of other people's research is that attitudes are informed by a huge and very complex range of different factors. Now they include your personal characteristics, how old you are, whether you're male, female, your ethnic background, your personal kind of migratory history, your circumstances economically, socially, culturally, the kind of information that you have access to, what media you read, your political ideology, whether you live next to migrants. So there's a whole very complex range of factors that go into attitude formation towards migration. And not just migration. Any issue that you have an opinion on will be informed by or influenced by these factors. And one of the things we know about migration is that actually it's often informed by your worldview. So it's not so much your political ideology, though it can be part of it, but it's kind of how you see the world. Are you a glass half empty, half full kind of person? Are you kind of very kind of global in your outlook? Are you more inward looking to your community? Or, you know, it's that kind of, the chances are if you see the world in a particular way, you'll see migration in a quite particular way too. And one of the things we did that was quite interesting was looking at changes in public attitudes towards refugees, specifically over 3 decades, using that BSA, British Social Attitudes Survey data that I told you about earlier. Because although the Ipsos Mori poll doesn't talk about asylum and refugees, the British Social Attitudes Survey does. The question is a little odd. It's framed something like, do you think we should give international protection for those in need of it? So it's very much framed in that sense. But what we did find is that that level of tolerance towards refugees has also declined alongside, you know, the generic information that we have about attitudes more generally. But that there are very significant attitudes in different areas of the country. And you'll hear about this anecdotally in terms of perhaps the Scots and the Welsh being a little bit more welcoming, a little bit more friendly towards people from the outside, in inverted commas. So people living in Wales, the Midland and north and south of England are more negative than those residing in London and Scotland. So that actually did away with our idea of the Croeso Gymru, come to Wales. It's not like that at all if you live in Wales, is it, Malca? It's a very different idea once you're actually there as an outsider on the inside, and I can tell you that as an English person growing up in Wales too. So it's not the case that actually the Welsh are as welcoming, but the Scottish certainly seem to be. But again, it reflects not just the national debate, but the local debate, particularly in terms of local labour markets, so a real drive reflected in the political agenda of the Scottish National Party and the Labour Party in Scotland about demographic change. We need young people, we need fresh talent in the labour market. So that's kind of motivated a different kind of political debate. And of course, local political leadership, I would argue, is crucially important. So I suppose ultimately, when it comes to understanding attitudes, and therefore the things that go into informing our current political debate, it's really important to understand that attitudes to migration are very complex and nuanced, and much more complex and nuanced than those mug that I showed you at the beginning were. Because most people, if you ask them, don't go for that one-liner, I want controls on immigration. They then say, but I'd quite like economic migration, I'm not so bothered about students. They are quite particular, actually, about what kinds of migration they do and don't have a problem with. What is clear also is that actually first-hand experience isn't necessarily a determining factor in terms of your attitude. So there is this idea, and it's more or less held up by the evidence, that the people who are most hostile to migration are the ones that have less experience of it, and the ones that are in least diverse areas. South Thanet would be a very good example. So that's Nigel Farage's seat. It's more diverse than it has been, but it's a fairly undiverse area. And those sorts of areas, the ones that are tending to be picked off by UKIP as places where they're more likely to get support. Now, all of this has led me to argue in the past, and I'm going to argue it again tonight because it's my sort of stock thing, and I think it's coming to become more evident, is that actually a lot of this doesn't have much to do with migration. It has much to do with other kinds of things that are going on in the local community, in the local labour market, in the situation more generally, or in individuals' personal lives. And in that context, what we see is what Stanley Cohen wrote about in the 1970s and again in the 2000s, this idea of a folk devil, somebody who kind of represents or symbolises the very things in society that they get anxious about or feel uncomfortable with. So when he was writing about folk devils in the 1970s, Stanley Cohen was writing about punks. He was writing about how punks challenged the idea of authority. They particularly challenged the idea of the monarchy. They were kind of kicking at all sorts of things which people at that time thought were really important. And so although they were incredibly small in number, punks, they were never going to overthrow the monarchy, they were seen as a threat to the sort of social order. He wrote again in 2002, and it's a great book, I'd really recommend it. He wrote in 2002 actually about asylum seekers in the same way, but the other group he wrote about was from the 80s, and he said that the group that represented the folk devil in the 80s were single mothers, because single mothers came to epitomise feminism, breakdown of the family, you know, all those sort of things that were happening in society in the 80s that people felt really uncomfortable with. So I find his narrative, his idea, really helpful, because for me, refugees and migrants more generally are symbolic of changes that are happening in communities that are really quite rapid as a consequence of globalisation. They're about changing structures, changing labour markets, globalised labour markets, people no longer living where they work, people's families being spread all over the place, and the thing in society, the group in society that most signifies that unease are migrants of one category or another. So I think it's quite a useful way of understanding this. I also think that politicians have a really big role to play in legitimating that narrative. So people feel these anxieties, they have these anxieties about what's going on. What does government do? It doesn't say, well actually, hang on a minute, it's okay, we're globalising, we benefit from migration, you know, we're going places too, as well as people coming here. No, on the contrary, what they do is say, actually, yeah, you're right, let's construct a discourse of managed migration, and we'll have this idea of good and bad migrants. Good migrants come here, they work, etc. bad migrants are illegal, they're asylum seekers. So you kind of construct a narrative around migration, which isn't about migration and globalization, but is about individuals being either good or bad and having good or bad consequences for society. And I think, as I say, it's much more about globalization and much more about what we'd call a threat perception of things like unemployment, insecurity, feelings of kind of often numerous and ill-defined enemies. And so you see an overlap with the security agenda in terms of the threat of the other, physically threatening us in our physical environment in terms of 9/11, 7/7. They all feed into this kind of fear of the other, again represented by the figure of the migrant. The other thing that I think the debate on migration and the political debate represents is actually, again, nothing really to do with migration. It's about nobody really trusts the authorities or the political establishment. So, you know, when people have a go at whichever party it is for being, as far as they're concerned, not stopping migration, not drawing a line, in fact, what they're saying is you don't have control over something that you should have control over. And so it's a kind of distrust in general about political power and political agency. And of course, all of these things are reflected in the media, which is constantly bombarding you with these ideas. So again, some research by the Migration Observatory found that the most common descriptor, this is recent research, for migrants is illegal, and failed is the most common descriptor for asylum seekers. So that tells you something about how this kind of political discourse is playing out in that. And just before I give you my personal reflections, of course, we should have a little bit of those headlines just to kind of, what I want you to do when you see these headlines, because there's quite a few of them, is just to think about what that headline is saying that isn't about migration, but is about something else. So if you could just let me know what the British way of life is when you've had to think about it. I haven't got a clue what that is, but it's kind of, immigrants are definitely ruining it, whatever it might be. Oh, they're bringing more crime. Now this is a really it's a really misrepresentative headline, because it was actually an ACPO report, an Association of Police Officers report, which said that there were more incidents of race hate crime recorded against migrants. So I guess they do bring more crime because there's more hate crime, but it does definitely imply that it's immigrants doing the hate rather than the British public. So there's always an element of truth. This is the 7/7 story, which I'm sure you've seen before, because it was really pernicious. So one of the 7/7 bombers arrived as a Somali refugee child, aged 6 or 7, I think. So I'm not really going to say any more about that, but there's all sorts of things in there about sponging and bombers, all wrapped up into one idea. So soft touch Britain, this idea that there's a failure of government policy, that people aren't controlling things. I'm going to just keep whacking them at you. I mean, if you're, Joe Public, who's going in and seeing these headlines every day, more or less, in the news agency, are you surprised that people are anxious? Britain opens doors to asylum seekers, crisis in schools, because of course all of our school problems are caused by migrants. Oh, they're flooding in again. They're in 4-star hotels. I mean, this life of luxury that and they're taking the NHS. So I mean, every single issue that people might be anxious about is being deflected onto, and this metaphor of the war. You get the flood, but you also get the migrant invasion. It's very common in the European context too, costing us a lot of money, of course, pouring again. I mean, these words are very interesting. We've got to ban migrants. This is actually quite true, and it's a reason why we should be dealing with the situation quite differently, because the 2011 census showed us that actually our diversity is changing, at a very rapid pace. I'm not sure that I would have chosen that way of framing the factual information, but it is true that there is a very rapid...
Isn't it true that always 100% of Britons have been ethnic?
Yeah, that's probably true too. Yes, because everybody has a race. Yeah. Absolutely.
Can I say something very quickly? Basically, and not being racist, that now the majority of people in Leicester will not be white,
yeah.
But we have a history, but dating back to the 30s in the Granby Hall, which is a car park near the Leicester Royal Infirmary, of Mosley preaching at Granby Hall. Is the centre of Leicester. And maybe they don't stand in the city, but they're all around. You know what I mean? So you know, it's particular to Leicester and that. The number of people we welcome to the city.
Absolutely, yeah. So anyway, just want to finish from the Sun. Actually, you may have noticed that every single headline up to that point was from 2 newspapers. Yeah? The Express and the Daily Mail. But here's one from the Sun. Just do it, or else. Or else, whatever that might be. So that's kind of where we're at in the political debate. I'm just going to wrap up by kind of saying a few things about my personal take on this, which you've probably got a fair sense of already. My view on this is that the current debate on migration, and it's not recent, it's actually been 2-3 elections back, 4 even, is that attitudes towards asylum and migration are much more about popular feelings of insecurity in which the outside world is viewed as a threat. And in that sense, that's why your worldview really matters as to whether or not you have a problem with migration. And that if you want to understand migration, really, you have to think of it as what we call a touchstone issue, which is to say that it's really about many other concerns about what's going on in society, and it's just a way, as Stanley Cohen has said, of kind of make sense of that and pinning it onto a particular group. And the people who've been most effective in some way of pinning it on that group have been politicians, who are always looking for a reason to say it's not our fault, the NHS isn't delivering, there aren't enough houses, the transport system is rubbish, you're in a queue on the M4. It's those damn migrants coming over and doing all of this stuff to us, and therefore it's not our fault, essentially. So, by way of conclusion, I would say, look, this is nothing new. None of this is new. Migration is a permanent feature of our societies. What is true is that the pace and scale of change has increased. There's no doubt about that. And when I showed you that chart of attitudes becoming more negative from 1997, for me there are 2 explanations. One is Labour came into power and suddenly wanted to keep demonstrating its control of migration by having legislation, which increased people's anxieties. The other was, if you map migration alongside it, it almost parallels it. So the increase in migration has matched the scale of the increase in attitudinal concern. That doesn't mean that one is causing the other. It's not a causal relationship or a correlation. It simply means that there is a relationship, but that relationship is as much governed by how we manage migration and deal with the politics of it as by the fact that it is here. So migration and increased religious, ethnic and cultural diversity is a permanent feature. There is no going back on this. And so from my perspective, as someone who's sort of, like you, sat through this again and again, sort of head in hands, it's about political leadership. It's about somebody being brave enough to say at the local level and nationally, this is the world we live in, and this is the world we are going to continue to live in for the next 20, 30 years. I talk to people who say, and I have this view myself actually, I hope in 20 or 30 years' time we'll look back at this time and go, what was that all about? Because actually, if you look at the demographics of here and the States, for example, there was a piece that came out the other day looking at demographic change in the US, and it had a photograph of the typical American in 30 years' time, and the typical American was not white. They were mixed race, and that is also probably going to be pretty much the case here. So there will be ethnic groups of different kinds, but there's also much more mixing between groups, and we know that across all of these different societies. So, you know, rather than legitimating concerns by arguing that migration is the problem, people should be, you know, reassured that actually this brings us things that we need to kind of come to terms with. So we need to reframe the debate rather than simply providing information or myth-busting. My experience of myth-busting, and I've done it for years, is people only receive information depending on their worldview. So actually we need to be changing people's worldview rather than simply providing them with facts. And we need to address some of the broader issues of which attitudes to migration are, in my view, a reflection, and that's the kind of thing I've been trying to talk about. And of course, for many of us in this room, me included, it's about protecting and promoting the principle of asylum, which has got completely lost in any of the debate around migration. It's like it doesn't exist anymore. But that's really something. And I don't know how you can see what goes on in Syria and Iraq and Iran and Congo and Somalia every day and not have any sense of any kind of international obligation or responsibility towards those individuals. From a kind of lived local experience, I think it's about us trying to do projects that focus on commonalities rather than differences. We all, regardless of our differences, have more in common. We all care about the same things ultimately. And the thing that I'm quite passionate about, and I'm a trustee of Migrant Voice, trustee of GARAS, the Gloucestershire Asylum Support Network and of Asylum Justice, is really about getting the voices of migrants into this debate. So it's always about migration and people talking about migrants rather than migrants having a voice themselves. And I'll just conclude with a much more positive note, which is the I Am an Immigrant campaign, launched tonight, but it's been on the tube since Friday because I went to London and saw the posters everywhere. Here's my very good friend Chalvin, who I had no idea was an immigrant, and so I saw his poster. I always just thought he was a really good lawyer and a great bloke, but anyway, it turns out he's an immigrant too. So it's about ways of getting people to relate to immigrants as human beings rather than as the other, which is kind of the narrative that dominates the political debate. Done, that's me, and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion. Thank you.